You have enough battery?
Yes, and I'll bring my charger in just in case.
It is, I can, as I've joined as a viewer, and I can see you at the moment. So I don't know if you wanted to like pause if we can like delay. Oh,
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah.
it was weird.
Yes. Let's see.
Hi,
Hi, Helen. How are you?
I'm all right, Brad. How are you?
Good. We're just checking on a couple of things.
You got there safely, though?
Yeah. It's not actually that far from where I live, so it took me like 30 minutes or so. So it's not too bad.
Excellent.
How was your day
Excellent.
today?
Not too bad, thank you. I'm just making sure I close all irrelevant windows so that nothing dings while
No dings,
while
no
we're all trying
pop-ups.
to talk. Yeah. Um, okay.
When I do the introduction, Helen, and then I just say sort of please join me in welcoming you. Uh, will you then just then take it away ultimately?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, just hand over to me and I'll
Okay.
take it away.
Okay. Cool. Good. Okay.
It's a funny thing, this virtual, you know, presence, isn't it? I much
Yeah.
prefer being in the room, but I do understand with the Atlantic in the way, it's much more practical.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
Hey guys, the for some reason it's not letting us set up a wait room, so as people join, they're going to be entering in real time.
Okay.
So Bob Titley is with us, I believe. So we should have been able to hold them in and like let everybody in at the same time, but I think they're going to join one by one.
Okay. Well, so Helen and I will just keep muted then until like 12 o'clock or something.
I think that's good as long as you guys are good with logistics and like Helen has screen share access. Does she have everything she needs?
You got your screen share and everything?
I do. Do you want me to do that now?
Let's,
Let's set it up, make sure everything's working,
yeah.
and then we'll start right at 12.
I need to send a request
Yeah.
to.
Go. Boom. Look at us doing stuff.
Okay, so then I click share. Um, I do I choose the application window or the entire screen? Does it matter? Entire screen?
I think entire screen
I
is
think it's probably
better.
best, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I do that. And then I go to slideshow view. Hang on, I go to slideshow view. And here we are.
Great.
All set?
Yeah. So what I would probably do is maybe, well, I guess we can keep that up now.
However you feel comfortable. Are you comfortable? You're going to be a little tile on a screen
Yeah.
when you do your introduction?
Yeah,
I'm okay with that. I think if
it's just between two of them.
Yeah, I think if we keep it as this, and then if we just maybe Helen, if we just take our cameras off for now, and then just mute until 12 o'clock, and then we'll start.
Mhm. Perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Brad. We're just going to wait a few more minutes. We got everyone logging on to the webinar as we speak, so we just want to make sure that we give everyone the chance. So it may just be five afternoon when we start. Keep you posted. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Just gonna again just to wait just a couple more minutes. Everyone's logging in as we speak. So we will start at 12:05. Thank you, everyone. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today it is a real great pleasure to welcome Helen Castor, one of our most compelling and humane historians of power. I was lucky enough to have a quick conversation with Helen a week or so ago, and a very special lady. She has read history at the University of Cambridge, where she also completed her PhD and went on to teach there for 9 years. Immersed not only in the archives, but in the enduring question that underpins all of her work, how power really works and what it does to the people who hold it. What sets Helen apart is the way that she writes history, not as destiny, but as a lived experience. Her work is very much rooted in character, psychology, and uncertainty, always shaped by the crucial understanding that while we know how history turns out, the people living it did not. Kings, queens, and courtiers move through her pages without foresight, making choices in the dark, driven by fear, conviction, ambition, and hope. It's history written with empathy, tension, and a novelist's sense of drama. Her influences reflect that breadth of imagination, from Hilary Mantel's inwardness and moral complexity to William Golding's fascination with power and human nature, alongside a lifelong love of science fiction and its great, timeless refrain, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, which made me very happy. It's perhaps no coincidence that her histories that once ancient and startlingly modern. Alongside her written and broadcasting, Helen has also served on the distinguished Booker Prize judgment panel, bringing her sharp eye for narrative and character to contemporary fiction. And while today we will be discussing the wonderful The England and the Hart, she is currently at work on a full biography of Elizabeth I, another ruler shaped by uncertainty, intelligence, and the perilous mechanics of power. So please join me and welcome Helen Castor. Thank you, Helen, for being with us today.
Brad, thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction. It's a delight to be joining you all from a very rainy London to talk about my book, The Eagle and the Hart, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. What I'm showing you on the screen now is the UK version of the cover because it gives equal visual billing to both Richard and Henry, that we have an eagle and a hart. A bit later on, I'll show you the exquisite image that is on the front of the book over on your side of the pond, and you can decide which you think is more fitting. Richard and Henry were first cousins. They were born in 1367, just 3 months apart. They were 10 years old when Richard became King of England, and they were 32 when Henry deposed him to become king in his place. Talking to friends while I was writing the book, I discovered that it sometimes helps at this point to explain that this Richard was neither the Lionheart nor the king in the car park, but the one in between. And I can add with absolute confidence that Richard would have hated me saying that, because the one thing that Richard knew with utter certainty was that he was special. He would have been outraged that those other two Richards have somehow aced him in the historical branding stakes in the half a millennium since we last had a king with his name. But there is consolation for him here somewhere. I think he would have loved the fact that what I think is Shakespeare's greatest history play, in fact, I'm inclined to say it's his greatest play altogether, certainly my favourite, is his. Shakespeare's Richard II speaks some of the most extraordinary poetry ever written. And at the heart of that poetry is an examination of the reason why Richard knew he was special. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. So Shakespeare's story in Richard II, and mine in The Eagle and the Hart, no pressure following in those footsteps, is the story of how this impossible thing came to happen. How and why did an anointed king come to lose his throne? And what did it do to the worldly men, Henry and the rest of England's people, who did depose the Lord's deputy? It's a huge story. I won't even try to tell it all in 45 minutes. But what I want to do today is to try to give you a sense of these two men as human beings and of what was at stake in the conflict that developed between them. It might seem implausible to say that I've set out to draw a psychological portrait of Richard and Henry, given how long ago they lived and the fact that there are no surviving private letters or diaries or other obvious way of getting behind the closed door of their public lives. But I do think it's possible. It's possible by joining scattered dots, by connecting what we do know. And one of the things we do know for certain is that they were three-dimensional, living, breathing human beings, to form a coherent picture of two closely related but astonishingly different men. And to do that, we need to start at the beginning. In 1377, England was united in grief at the death of the boy's grandfather, Edward III, one of the greatest kings that England had ever known. I think it's a bit easier for us now, ever since the death of Elizabeth II in 2022, than it's been in our lifetimes before, to imagine the shock and the sense of dislocation for England's people. Edward had ruled for 50 years, and almost no one could remember a time when he hadn't been king. We live now in very different times, but still, so much is familiar in descriptions of Edward's funeral, the cortege winding its way slowly through London's streets, the coffin followed on foot to Westminster Abbey by Edward's 3 surviving sons. But Edward's eldest son wasn't among them. The Black Prince, the hero of England's long-standing war with France, had died a year earlier after a long illness. And that meant that the crown would skip a generation to rest instead on the head of the Black Prince's son, Richard. Richard was 10, and for as long as he could remember, he'd been told he was special. As his father's only surviving legitimate child, he was unique. He was irreplaceable. His mother, Joan of Kent, had been married before. This was a deeply unusual royal marriage, the marriage of the Black Prince and Joan of Kent, in all sorts of ways. It was almost unheard of for an heir to the throne to wait till he was 31 to choose his own bride, and then to choose a woman who was not only a close relative, they were first cousins once removed, but who'd been married twice before in circumstances that bordered on scandal. Joan had been allowed to annul her marriage to her first husband in order to marry her second. So if you hear the very beautiful Joan described as the fair maid or the virgin of Kent, bear in mind it's sarcastic. But what it meant for Richard was that he was at the same time his parents' only surviving child, and he was the cosseted baby of a larger family in which he, unlike his 4 half-brothers and sisters from his mother's previous marriage, he stood alone in the line of royal succession. But Richard had never seen kingship in action. For as long as he could remember, his father and his grandfather had been too ill to lead England's government. The lords who were trying to keep the war effort going on their behalf were facing growing complaints about military failures and high taxation. And in January 1377, in their attempt to unite the country, they presented Richard, who was just a few weeks past his 10th birthday, to Parliament as a prince sent by his grandfather in the same manner as the scripture says, "Here is my beloved son, here is he who is wished for by all men." They were bound to do him honour and reverence, the Chancellor went on, the Chancellor who happened also to be a bishop, in the manner the pagans, that is to say, the 3 kings, did to the Son of God when they offered him gold, myrrh, and frankincense. Now, the seasoned politicians in Parliament, sitting listening to the Chancellor, knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to unite the country by identifying England with the Holy Land, England's king with God and England's heir with Christ. This was powerful but pretty unsubtle rhetoric. But Richard wasn't a seasoned politician. He was 10, and he'd just heard himself described as the Messiah. And all of that happened while he was looking at an extraordinary painting, which I can't show you because all that's left of it is this impressionistic glimpse. This, or what this is a much later painting of what remained of it, was the biggest image on the walls of the painted chamber in the Palace of Westminster, the medieval palace, an extraordinary room more than 80 feet long and 30 feet high, where Parliament often met. Most of the walls of the painted chamber were covered in the stories of biblical kings and tyrants, painted as though they were comic strips around the walls. But this one, at one end of the room, was a monumental image of the coronation of Edward the Confessor, the 11th century Saint King of England, whose shrine stood and still stands behind the high altar in Westminster Abbey. Now, the original of this painting isn't there anymore because in 1834, almost all of the medieval palace burned down. And even before that, the walls of the painted chamber had been covered over with whitewash. But they were briefly uncovered during repairs in 1819. And that's when these watercolour sketches of what survived of them were made. Only 7 months after sitting looking at this painting, Richard himself was crowned and anointed in Westminster Abbey. It was a moment of overwhelming solemnity and sanctity for the small boy at its centre. And again, I think we have a bit more of a sense of that, having just watched the same ceremony take place in exactly the same spot for King Charles III. Richard was so small that as he was carried from the abbey in the arms of his tutor, a man named Sir Simon Burley, one of the confessor's adult-sized slippers that formed part of the coronation regalia fell from his foot and got lost in the crush. I think we'd be able to guess how much of an impact that ceremony had on a young mind, even without any further evidence, but there is some. Nearly 20 years later, Richard commissioned this life-sized portrait of himself to be placed in the choir of the abbey. And again, it's still in the abbey. Now it's by the west door, but it used to be placed much nearer the high altar. It's a portrait that, as a panel painting, is unprecedented in the history of the English monarchy. And it's not only unprecedented, there wouldn't be another to match it for another 100 years or more, really until we get to the Tudors. And it seems to me to be a self-conscious reference not only to the memory of Richard's own coronation when he was a boy, but also to the iconic image of the confessor to which he'd compared himself on the wall of the painted chamber. So Richard was acutely conscious of how a king should look, how he should be viewed by his subjects, and what his image should mean. But this moment of coronation, this moment of enthronement, wasn't the only symbolic image on the day of his crowning. Richard had been attended throughout the ceremony by the great nobles of England, led by his 3 royal uncles. The oldest, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the middle one, Edmund of Langley, and the youngest, Thomas of Woodstock. But at the feast afterwards in Westminster Hall, Gaunt was busy in his ceremonial role as Steward of England, marshalling the crowds of guests and servants on horseback. So his place beside Richard's chair, holding the ceremonial sword of justice, for anyone who watched the coronation, the Penny Mordaunt role, if you like, that place was taken by Gaunt's son, 10-year-old Henry of Bolingbroke. And the message was clear. One day, when Richard was old enough to rule, his cousin Henry would stand at his right hand as Duke of Lancaster, his greatest nobleman and his greatest support. No one at that point was overcome with emotion, clearly. No one at that point was questioning that vision of the future, partly because it was unimaginable that the relationship between these two boys might one day break down as disastrously as it did, but also because there was quite enough to worry about in the present. The new king, as I've said, was 10. How should the kingdom be governed until Richard was old enough to rule for himself? In theory, the obvious answer was that John of Gaunt should serve as regent. He was the king's oldest surviving uncle and the kingdom's most powerful magnate. But in practice, Gaunt was too unpopular to be put in charge of government because of the leading role he'd taken in the last fractious years of Edward III's reign, and because he was unfairly suspected of wanting to make himself king in his nephew's place. History doesn't repeat, as the saying goes, but it does often rhyme. And the wicked uncle turns out to be a recurring theme in England's history. There'd already, at the beginning of the 13th century, been the story of bad King John and his little nephew Arthur. And, of course, there would be another wicked Uncle Richard later on. In any case, the reality was that Gaunt didn't want the job. He was an ambitious man. He was a very proud man. But whatever the rumours said, he was unswervingly loyal. And by now he'd had enough of the brickbats. He already knew, one of the chroniclers reported, that he'd get the blame for everything and thanks for nothing. So Gaunt was unappointable, but he was also too powerful for anyone to be appointed in his place. The only workable solution was to fudge the issue. Officially, there would be no minority. The 10-year-old king would rule. Excuse me, I'll take a... There we go, that's better. Unofficially, decisions taken in the king's name by his lords would be made behind the scenes by his nobles. A young man growing to maturity who understood the duties as well as the powers and the rights of his crown might have come to understand why such misrepresentation of reality was necessary and what he was required to do to take command when the time came. But Richard was not that young man, because Richard had always known that he was special. And when he looked at the government that was being conducted in his name, he didn't see loyal nobles desperately trying to keep the political show on the road in the face of huge challenges. He saw overmighty subjects usurping his own God-given power. And in 1381, amid the chaos and violence of what we now know as the Peasants' Revolt, he found that Wat Tyler's rebels agreed with him. They overran London, which gives me the chance to show you this, which is my favourite medieval depiction of London. You can see the Thames is wending its way through the picture in the foreground and the background. There, right at the back, is London Bridge, which at the time was the only bridge over the Thames, with its 19 narrow arches and shops and houses all the way across. In the foreground, you can see ferrymen and ferry boats taking passengers across the width of the Thames, but there in the centre is the White Tower of the Tower of London. And I need to emphasise that that great archway that you can see in the side wall is not, in fact, a realistic depiction of the medieval tower. It's a cutaway so that the illustrator can show us what's going on inside. It wasn't that easy to get in. Despite the fact that it wasn't that easy to get in, the rebels broke in and seized control. They killed the Chancellor and the Treasurer, and they paraded their heads on pikes through the streets. And on those streets, they had a password to identify their own. You could be stopped and asked, "With whom hold you?" The right answer was, "With King Richard and the true commons." And those who did not know how to reply or would not do so, a London chronicler noted, were beheaded and put to death. It's often said, with some justification, that 14-year-old Richard was very brave when he rode out to meet the rebels, first at Mile End and then at Smithfield. But we also need to remember that he was the one person among the ruling classes who was uniquely and specifically safe, because in the rebels' eyes, he was their God-given leader, not a target. And as it turned out, Richard agreed with them. He was their God-given leader, and the government carried out in his name, he believed, was corrupt and failing. But his conclusion wasn't that he must learn to rule his people well. He had no interest in fighting to defend his kingdom in the ongoing war with France. He had no interest in the hard work of negotiating peace, and he had no interest within England itself in the importance of upholding the law and providing his subjects with justice. The war with France was now going so badly that the treasury was empty. England's territories on the continent were under assault. Not only that, but the south coast was repeatedly damaged by French raids. In other words, the war wasn't just happening over there in France, it was coming home to roost. The towns of Rye, Hastings, and Lewis had been sacked and burned only a fortnight before Richard's coronation, and the very real danger only intensified in the years that followed. But to Richard, that was all a tedious irrelevance. In 1383, when the Lords, led by his uncle Gaunt, were trying to secure funding for an urgent military campaign in Flanders, which had just been overrun by French troops, Richard was 16, the age at which his father, the Black Prince, had won his spurs so heroically at the Battle of Crécy. In other words, Richard was old enough to lead his troops, or at least to ride into battle beside his generals as they did so. But there was one fundamental flaw in this otherwise brilliant plan. As one chronicler laconically put it in Latin, rex laborare noluit. The king didn't want to go. Instead, his sights were set on the lords themselves, the men he believed were standing in his way in England. In 1384 and 1385, while John of Gaunt tried to defend the north against the Scots and simultaneously find terms for peace with the French, Richard and his favourites were plotting at court, unsuccessfully, to murder him. And in 1386, with Gaunt by now fighting abroad, a parliament led by Richard's youngest uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, tried to force the 19-year-old king to focus on the imminent and terrifying threat of invasion by a French armada, more than 1,000 ships carrying many thousands of men and horses mustering at a Flemish port with a plan to land on the beaches of East Anglia. Richard's furious response was that he would ask for help against Parliament's insolence from his cousin, the French king, and rather submit ourselves to him than succumb to our own subjects. This was dumbfounding. It was bordering on delusional. A French armada was coming, the biggest fleet assembled to cross the Channel since 1066. And at this, of all possible moments, England's king was choosing to suggest that he might look for help to France to resist calls from his subjects asking him to rule them properly. It was a shocking demonstration that Richard had grown into a thin-skinned narcissist whose understanding of power was focused entirely on himself and his own will, rather than the needs of his people. But while Richard was talking to his French cousin, or talking about his French cousin at the very least, his English cousin saw matters entirely differently. Like Richard, Henry of Bolingbroke was his father's only legitimate son. He was the heir to John of Gaunt's Duchy of Lancaster. But unlike Richard, he didn't grow up in royal isolation from his family of strong-willed siblings. Henry had two extremely formidable older sisters. He also had a half-sister from his father's second marriage, and he had 4 half-siblings, 3 boys and a girl, who were given the name of Beaufort, born to Gaunt's mistress, Catherine Swynford, a warm and intelligent woman who, after the early death of Henry's mother, took charge of the bustling Lancastrian nursery. Richard's education, or what we can see of it, was a protective, gilded cocoon in which he was exposed to neither physical risk nor intellectual challenge. But Henry's was the opposite. It was designed to be demanding preparation for the responsibilities he would one day inherit as Duke of Lancaster. He was trained to fight, He began jousting at court at the age of just 13, and he shadowed his father to learn how to lead men in peace and in war. He loved books, he loved music, and he won admiration wherever he went. I don't want to make him sound blandly nice or like some sort of goody two-shoes, but it is apparent how easily and how deeply he made friends among the people who surrounded him. He was loved by all, a chronicler in France later said, after he'd spent some time in Paris. And a young Italian noblewoman named Lucia Visconti later said that if she'd been sure of marrying Henry, she would have waited to the very end of her life, even if she knew she was going to die 3 days after the wedding. He'd obviously made quite an impression. Henry also understood the dangers that loomed when government wasn't functioning well. During the revolt of 1381, while Richard was discovering the unique powers of his crown, Henry was almost killed when the rebels overran the tower. He was saved from death only by the kindness of one rebel, a smallholder from Kent named John Ferrer, whom Henry remembered for the rest of his life. And he saw at first hand the relentless efforts his father made to defend England's interests through diplomacy and war. And he saw how bitterly Gaunt was rewarded with plots to destroy him. And then, in 1386, 19-year-old Henry was entrusted with the safeguarding of Lancastrian interests while Gaunt was abroad. Sitting in Parliament, he supported the takeover of government by a council under Thomas of Woodstock's leadership to resist the French invasion that Richard was so egregiously ignoring. In the end, to huge English relief, that invasion was thwarted by the weather and by the sheer size of the fleet itself, which couldn't sit forever or for very long at all, with its ships stuffed with men and animals waiting for the wind to turn. That's why we haven't heard of the French Armada of 1386. But given the extreme threats that Richard had issued against those who tried to make him recognise reality, the council's work continued. And Henry watched as Richard responded by removing himself from Westminster and declaring that all those who had supported the appointment of the council should be punished as traitors. The threat of a French invasion had been bad enough, but this was terrifying. Treason was the worst of all possible crimes, carrying the worst of all possible punishments, a hideous death for the traitor himself, and the destruction of his name and his line through the permanent forfeiture of his estates. And for that very reason, it had been carefully and closely defined as a crime by Richard's grandfather, Edward III, in a statute of 1352. But Richard was now taking the definition of treason entirely into his own hands, because he was saying that anyone who made the king do something against his will, or anyone who persuaded the king to do something against his will, was a traitor. And who could retrospectively determine if the king had done something against his own will or been persuaded into something against his own will, apart from the king himself? When Richard came back to London in November 1387, these threats prompted Thomas of Woodstock and 2 other noblemen, the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, to arm themselves against him. They said they were trying to remove the favourites around the king who were the real traitors to the realm. This, of course, was a deflection of blame from Richard himself. It was partly a desperate attempt to protect these 3 rebel lords from charges of treason. But it also reflected the fact that there was no alternative. Richard had no obvious heir. He had no son. He had no brother who could replace him on the throne without risking a wholesale descent into anarchy. But no deflection could avert the confrontation that was coming. And when it became clear that negotiations couldn't work because Richard's word couldn't be trusted, 2 younger lords joined Woodstock, Arundel and Warwick in rebellion. A young nobleman named Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham, and Richard's cousin Henry. This was the fork in the road. This was the moment that would determine the path of Richard and Henry's relationship. and with it, the whole shape of England's future. The two boys had never got on, but this was a breach from which there would be no coming back. Henry led the forces that defeated Richard's favourite Robert de Vere at the Battle of Radcliffe Bridge and drove de Vere into exile. And that mattered, because de Vere was the only person whose interests had ever mattered to Richard as much as his own. De Vere was his whole heart, one chronicler said. If de Vere said black was white, Richard wouldn't contradict him. And then in 1388, at what became known as the Merciless Parliament, the five rebel lords known as the Lords Appellant, Henry and his allies, charged Richard's closest advisors with treason. De Vere wasn't there to face the death penalty, but there was a spate of executions, including the death of Richard's former tutor, Simon Burley, the man who had carried him in his arms from his coronation. The rebel lords, in other words, were playing a profoundly dangerous game in the hope that the king might learn a necessary lesson. And Richard had no choice but to comply, until in 1389 he was able to reclaim his place at the head of normal royal government with the help of the newly returned and always dutiful John of Gaunt. An uneasy peace was restored, the calm after the storm, and a chance to see if this new normal might possibly hold, which gave Henry, at the age of 22, the chance to put some distance between himself and his cousin and to seek adventure and reputation and fun by travelling across Europe and beyond. He and a small band of his household men, his close friends in other words, went to Prussia, and they fought alongside the crusading order of Teutonic Knights against the pagans of Lithuania. And when he went back a second time, only to find that a treaty had derailed the campaign he was hoping to fight, he decided to go on as a pilgrim, travelling in style overland through the magnificent courts of Europe to Venice, and then on by boat to Jerusalem, where not even the great crusading kings of England, the Lion Heart and Edward I, had ever set foot. He came back laden with gifts, not only gorgeous furs and cloth of gold from Venice, but a few items his young wife Mary, waiting at home at Peterborough with their 4 little boys, might have been slightly less happy to see. He bought her a parrot in Italy, so far so good, but he'd also somehow picked up an ostrich in Prague, and most spectacularly, he'd been given a hunting cheetah, probably by the King of Cyprus, and I always wonder what Mary must have thought when she saw this baggage train rumbling up the drive. While Henry was becoming one of the most glamorous men in Europe, back at home, Richard was seeking to free himself from the financial and political constraints that had forced him to submit to his subjects' control. Richard's first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died in 1394, which gave Richard a welcome chance to design the double tomb in which she and one day he would lie. That meant that he could commission 2 gilded bronze effigies, his and hers portraits. And every time I look at these 2 effigies, I wonder whether Richard liked Anne because she looked really like him, or whether Richard just thought that everybody ought to look like him, and therefore the instructions given to the coppersmiths were to make twin portraits. Not only could he commission these effigies, but he could eventually write his own epitaph, in which he compared himself to Homer and declared that he had, or would have had, whenever he would eventually lie beside Anne in splendour, subdued the mighty and cut down anyone who violated the rights of the crown. If that was a startling statement of intent, it was also accompanied by a new form of self-assertion. He adopted a new badge, the white hart, which he began to plaster across the great palaces and churches of his kingdom. This one is in Westminster Abbey. It's in the first floor gallery above Poets' Corner. And in this photograph, if you can see it taken from Poets' Corner on the ground, but you can see it right in the centre. And I hope you can see how well, in its original golden glory, that wall painting would have caught the light, either from the windows or from torches burning down below. It was also a badge that would be worn by people, by a new military retinue of knights and archers who answered only to Richard's personal authority. In theory, a king could call on the service of all his people. So the question raised by this private retinue was why Richard thought he needed it and what he intended to use it for. Queen Anne's death also made it possible for Richard to pause the war with France by agreeing the next best thing to a permanent peace, a 28-year truce sealed in 1396 by Richard's glittering wedding to the 6-year-old daughter of the French king. It's a wedding that also raises interesting questions, I think, about Richard's sense of himself in time. He clearly felt no urgency as a 29-year-old marrying a 6-year-old about fathering a child, and perhaps even a wish not to. There were practical political reasons not to, because for as long as he didn't have a son, he could hold on to the estates of the Principality of Wales and the Earldom of Chester, around which he was now building his new private army. But also, I suspect, Richard didn't really want to contemplate a future without himself at its centre. And the summit, convened just outside Calais for the wedding itself, Richard's very own Field of the Cloth of Gold, also prompted him to commission the most exquisite painting that medieval England ever produced. On its outside because it's a hinged panel painting, in two pieces with a hinge in the middle, making a portable altarpiece, so you can close it up to travel around and then you open it to stand on your altar when you arrive where you're going. And on one of the outside panels is this absolutely glorious painting of Richard's white hart. And it's this image that graces the US cover of my book. I'm so lucky that they agreed to reproduce it in all its splendor. But inside, that's not the last white hart we're going to see. Inside, on the left-hand panel, we have Richard being presented by his 3 patron saints. The 2 wearing crowns are the 2 royal saints of England. On the far left, King Edmund the Martyr, carrying the arrow that was the instrument of his martyrdom. In the middle, we have Richard's particular patron and the patron saint of Westminster Abbey, Edward the Confessor, and then we have John the Baptist. Richard's birthday on the Feast of the Epiphany, 6th of January, was also celebrated as the feast day of the baptism of Christ by St. John the Baptist. And they are presenting Richard too on the right-hand panel, the Virgin and Child and the assembled ranks of the angels in heaven. And it's not just an exquisite portrait, because every one of these bored-looking angels, slightly bored at any rate, is wearing the broom-cod collar of Richard's new father-in-law of France, and also on their breasts Richard's own white hart. So the lesson that Richard had learned, it turned out, was not the one his subjects had hoped. Instead, he had laid the groundwork for what he saw as a restoration of the power he'd always believed should be his. And in 1397, he made his move. He launched a coup within his own kingdom. Thomas of Woodstock and the Earls of Arundel and Warwick were arrested and charged with treason for their actions 10 years earlier, actions for which they had been explicitly pardoned by the king. But in Richard's brave new world, those pardons weren't worth the parchment on which they were written. Arundel was tried, found guilty as a traitor, and executed. Thomas of Woodstock, the son of Edward III, the uncle of the king himself, was murdered behind the walls of his Calais prison, his death initially completely unexplained. And the Earl of Warwick, who sobbed and begged wretchedly for his life in Parliament, something which pleased Richard immensely, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Their junior partners of 10 years before, Henry and Mowbray, were untouched so far, but found themselves in an appallingly compromised and invidious position. They had been complicit in the destruction of Woodstock and Arundel in the attempt to save their own skins. But Richard had already gone back on his word so many times that they were now terrified of what might follow. And while Richard tightened his grip on England through military force and judicial insecurity, fear drove Henry and Mowbray to accuse one another of treachery. Richard decreed that the truth should be tried by combat. This is the moment at which Shakespeare's Richard II begins. It's one of the great set pieces in theatre, just as it was at Coventry in 1398 in reality. People had come from all over Europe to see these champions fight. The duel had been 5 months in preparation. Henry was wearing the finest Milanese armour. Mowbray's armour had come from Prague. And out of nowhere, as the two champions sat on their horses in their armour with their lances couched, Richard said, "Stop." And he decreed that instead of fighting, they must both leave their homes and families and go into exile. Mowbray for life, Henry for 10 years. England now was through the looking glass. 3 of the kingdom's greatest nobles had already been destroyed. Now 2 more were banished without being tried or convicted of any offence. No royal judgment, no royal promise, it seemed, could ever be trusted. Richard declared that Henry and Mowbray in exile would be allowed to take possession of any lands they might inherit back in England. This was a crucial stipulation for men who represented 2 of the greatest dynasties in the country. But once again, Richard lied. When John of Gaunt died, heartbroken, in February 1399, the king took Henry's Duchy of Lancaster into his own royal hands. Believing he'd destroyed the power of the cousin he hated, Richard sailed with his army for Ireland, where he'd already enjoyed watching the Irish chiefs kneel in homage before him a few years earlier. But Richard didn't realise that in disinheriting Henry, what he'd destroyed was his own power. If even the greatest nobleman in England couldn't rely on the protection of the law against the king's arbitrary will, then no one could. And England's people looked for rescue to Henry, the Eagle Duke, as a poet called him, after a badge his father Gaunt and grandfather Edward III had used. When Henry landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire with a small band of loyal followers, England rallied to his banner. And by the time Richard managed to return from Ireland, his kingdom was already lost. Richard still had no son to succeed him. In practice, the Eagle Duke, his first cousin, a fine soldier and able leader, was the only possible candidate to rule in his place. And on the 13th of October 1399, the feast of Richard's patron, Edward the Confessor, Henry was crowned in Westminster Abbey. But the one attribute of sovereignty Henry lacked was the one Richard still had: birthright. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. A king who had become a tyrant was replaced by a king who was a usurper, and that meant that Henry's throne would always be vulnerable. Just how vulnerable became obvious less than 3 months later, when the handful of nobles who'd been closest to Richard rose in revolt. The rebellion was put down, but the danger of a living ex-king was clear. Within weeks, it was announced that Richard had died in his prison. Starved to death, rumour said. In order to save England from Richard's tyranny, Henry had not only done what his cousin had always feared, usurped his power, but committed the sin of regicide. A man who believed in justice and in the sacred authority of kingship had been forced to violate both in his attempt to preserve the kingdom. The rest of Henry's life would be spent trying to escape Richard's shadow, in the hope that good government and God's blessing might one day justify his claim to England's crown. He never quite succeeded in emerging into the sunlight. His usurpation made him vulnerable. Anyone who felt dissatisfied with his rule could, and did, use that immediate justification as an excuse for rebellion. And in 1406, just when it seemed that years of firefighting might have succeeded at last in damping down the flames of revolt, Henry's health collapsed. The man who had once been a golden boy was never truly well again. His enemies were quick to see his suffering as evidence of God's judgment against him. And when he made his will in 1409, during a particularly bad bout of illness, it was an anguished plea for forgiveness from a man who couldn't rest easy in the knowledge that what he'd done had been righteous. Royal wills were usually deeply formal documents written in French or Latin using the royal we, but Henry's was in English, and it was profoundly personal. It begins, "I, Henry, sinful wretch, by the grace of God, King of England and of France and Lord of Ireland, bequeath to Almighty God my sinful soul, the which had never been worthy to be man, but through his mercy and his grace, which life I have misspent, whereof I put me wholly in his grace and his mercy with all my heart." Henry didn't ask for an elaborate funeral or a costly monument. The fine tomb in which he lies in Canterbury Cathedral was commissioned by his widow, Joan of Navarre, whose effigy lies beside him. But I think you can see in this alabaster face traces of the cost of what he'd done, as well as the prize he'd gained, the crown that he'd passed on to his son, Henry V, against what had sometimes seemed impossibly long odds. And this face reminds me of 3 lines from Shakespeare's Richard II that I find profoundly moving. They're spoken in the play by Richard himself. "I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king?" The real Richard never understood that it was precisely this shared humanity that stood at the heart of kingship. That was his tragedy. And I think it was Henry's tragedy that he knew it all along. Thank you very much for listening.
That was wonderful. It was a beautiful way to finish it. Thank you, Helen. It's incredible that you were able to sort of bring that together in short of 50 minutes. So thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, if I may. We have a question from Laurie. So I am wondering if Helen thinks that if the Black Prince would have lived to rule as a king, at least for a few years. Oh, question's gone. Where did it go? Oh, sorry. There we go. I'll start again. If Helen thinks if the Black Prince would have lived to rule as king, at least for a few years, and young Richard would have had the chance to observe him, if it would have had an impact on the type of king that he would ultimately have become.
It's an absolutely fascinating question, that. Yes, the alternate universe in the Plantagenet metaverse in which we get a different playing out of this story. It is entirely possible. I don't think Richard's education would have been the same. The Black Prince was a soldier through and through, and the idea that he might have allowed his son to, if you like, get away with not being trained up for, not having to step into the armor that represented part of the fundamental job of a medieval king. Because if you look on the Great Seal of England, there's an image of the king on either side that represents 2 of the most fundamental functions of kingship. On one side, there's a king on a throne wearing a crown, carrying an auburn scepter to be a judge, to give justice to his people, a lawgiver. And on the other side, he's in armor on a war horse, brandishing a naked sword in his hand to defend his kingdom. And in the Middle Ages, attack was often the best form of defense. So going to war in France was a very good way of making sure that the war did happen over there and that you might get some more territory out of it, rather than finding England's coast attacked. And I can't see that the Black Prince would have allowed Richard to be wrapped in the cotton wool that his mother and her advisors did once he was the only representative of their line. She might, of course, have had some more children, but that then brings into play the fact that the Black Prince, while he'd been a great warrior, had also been very indulged by his father. To wait until you're 31, when you're the heir to the throne, to marry a woman who's older than you, And so Joan was already about 40 when Richard was born. So might they have had more children? Might there have been a spare as well as an heir? And that sort of sense of indulgence, because of course, if the Black Prince had been made to get married when he was 21, not 31, then any son of his might have been 20, not 10, when Edward III died. If he'd not had that kind of emotional indulgence, he might not have been the kind of character he seems to have been, which was quite Richard-like, apart from the militarism. In other words, he ran a very magnificent court, one which emphasized the glory of his authority, the one that showed how set apart he was. So I suppose I'm saying possibly yes and possibly no. I suspect the Black Prince would have made Richard fight, whether or not he would have hated it as much as he seems to have done. And then the moment his father died, put down his sword and refused to go any further. I don't know. But it's possible that this rather grandiose sense of the rights of kingship and the refusal to acknowledge the responsibilities, it's possible we're already seeing it in the Black Prince. We don't see it in Edward III, but it's possible we're already seeing it in the Black Prince. It's a fascinating question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. If I may have a quick question. So during Shakespeare's writing, and certainly in your book, once Henry wins the crown, he he never really seems to enjoy it, or he has so many hurdles to overcome. This is a very simplistic question, but do you think there was ever a time where he kind of just simply went, "This is a really bad idea"? I mean, you kind of alluded to it, but do you feel that way?
The anguish that is present in the will that I read you the beginning of, it is extraordinary on a human level. I mean, it is. I can't really emphasize enough what an unusual document it is. I mean, if you read Richard's will, of course, it's all very formal and largely concerned with two things. One is how grand his funeral needs to be at some point in the far distant future. He doesn't want to think about his own death, but he does know he'd like to be buried in white satin with gold jewelry and so on. But also he wants to make sure that his will be enforced from beyond the grave. So in other words, he's not really thinking about the reality of it at all, except within his own sort of narcissistic fantasy. Whereas Henry leaves named bequests to the half a dozen domestic servants who are keeping watch night and day round his bedside in his illness. And he is clearly desperately concerned about the fate of his soul. He's not putting elaborate bequests into play on his own account. He's saying, my spiritual mentor, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who has been at my side throughout this process, he's the one who's going to look after my funeral, look after my burial, and make sure that anything that can be done for my soul can be done. So yes, I think Henry is desperately concerned about what the judgment of God is going to be. I also think he felt he didn't have a choice, because if we're thinking about counterfactuals, which is always a sort of helpful question, a helpful check to put into play, I don't think one can get very far with them because you very quickly hit too many variables. But if Henry had not stepped up in 1399, if he'd not said, okay, I'm going to take this on my shoulders, Richard must go and I'm going to take the throne in his place, if no one had challenged Richard, what would have been England's fate? It was already clear that the rule of law was on the way out, that the king's will, which could change from moment to moment, was the only arbiter left. In other words, there was no security for any of England's people. So somebody had to step up, in a sense, if that future for England was going to be averted. But one of the problems here is if you're faced with a ruler determined to break the constitution through which he had come to power, you might have to break the constitution even more to remove him. And then how do you set all the security features back as you had found them? So I suspect Henry didn't have much fun. He was firefighting the whole time, and then latterly, when the flames had been tamped down a bit, he was ill a lot of the time, and it was a deeply unpleasant illness. By the last years of his reign, the most trouble he was having within his own government was from what we might call loyal opposition. His own son, the future Henry V, and some allies of his son in government who were basically saying, "Come on, old man, we have to remember that Henry wasn't even 46 when he died. So in Henry IV's mind, he wasn't an old man. He was struggling with illness, but saying, "Come on, old man, move over. It's my time now." And Henry was saying, "Just hold your horses. It will be your turn in not too long, but I'm still king." He didn't have an easy ride, but he was still surrounded by friends. His second marriage seems to have been as happy as his first. He genuinely liked women. He didn't only sort of use women as wives and mistresses. You can see in various parts of his life, including the care he took to look after Lucia Visconti, this young Italian noblewoman whom he might at one point have married as his second wife, didn't manage to, but he rescued her from the violence and the complexity of Milanese politics and found her a dashing English husband, brought her over and gave her away at her wedding. He genuinely had deep friendships and meaningful relationships. And my editor kept saying, "You've become very fond of Henry, haven't you?" I am very fond of Henry, but I hope there was consolation for him in those really brutally difficult years, and also in the knowledge that he'd raised a supremely able son. And I hope he knew that in Henry V, he was leaving England in extremely safe hands.
Yeah, I was going to ask you which of the characters that you were really kind of that really fascinated you through the research. It sounds like Henry was the one that you really kind of had a connection is probably the wrong word to use, but that you really were kind of
Well,
enthralled by.
our connection is, I mean, it may sound hubristic, but in a sense, when you're trying to imagine yourself deep into this world, it does feel as though, at least with my version of Henry, I am very fond of him.
Yeah,
It's impossible not to be a bit fascinated by Richard, by
right.
the theatrical, narcissistic performance he puts on. But I should also perhaps put in a word for, this is a very masculine story because politics were very male at this period, but there are lots of extraordinary women around the edges of this story, and I tried to give them their moments whenever they move into the spotlight briefly. Also, the Archbishop I mentioned, Archbishop Arundel, who's a fascinating character. He's the younger brother of the Earl of Arundel, who is executed in 1397, and there's a new book coming out about him in the spring this year with Yale University Press by Chris Gibbon Wilson, who's one of the great figures of English medieval history, and that's a fascinating read. So I heartily recommend that. And I'm sure lots of people are way ahead of me, but my friend and compatriot and colleague, Dan Jones, published a book last year at the same time as The Eagle and the Hart came out about Henry V, and it is a superb read and sheds extraordinary light on a really remarkable man, and a man whose head is quite difficult to get into the inside of, but I think Dan has really managed it. So if anyone feels like a variety of medieval reading, those are my two recommendations, to go, of course, with The Eagle and the Hart.
Thank you, Helen. If I might just have one more question from Alex. It's kind of a two questions really. Is there any historical or what is the historical record of when Shakespeare's play was written and performed? And even though it was obviously later, was there any negativity from the royal family in terms of how these characters were portrayed?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. It was a great hit, Richard II, when it was first performed in the late 1590s. And part of the reason it was a great hit, it seems to have been around, if I'm remembering right, I used to have all these details at my fingertips, 1596. Part
We'll
of the
trust you.
reason, okay, part of the reason it was a great hit was that it was so topical. Now, you might not think it was an immediate parallel to draw between Richard, this narcissistic, performative king who got deposed, with Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs England ever had. But actually, if you look specifically at the context of the 1390s and the 1590s, there are, for Elizabeth, rather alarming parallels in play. They were both childless monarchs for very different reasons. I mean, there were very good reasons Elizabeth had ended up being childless. As a woman, it wasn't easy for her to marry and have children without compromising her own power, whereas for Richard, he had no excuse. But also there was a lot of trouble in Ireland, the risk of rebellious Irish chiefs over there and having to send troops over to try to pacify that. These were live political issues in the 1590s. And so when the play was performed, those resonances were echoing around the theatres where it was seen. And then in 1601, when Elizabeth's former favourite, also a rather narcissistic figure, the Earl of Essex, ended up rebelling against her. The night before his rebellion was launched in February 1601, some of his supporters paid to have a play about Richard II, probably Shakespeare's, put on and performed the night before their rebellion. And already when Shakespeare's play had been printed, and it went through several editions straight away, which shows us how popular a text this was. By order of the censors, the deposition scene was left out. It was too much of a hot potato to put that into print. Elizabeth didn't like the idea of talking about the removal of a king. And in April 1601, so after the failure of Essex's rebellion and his execution for treason, she was in the Tower going through some of the archives with the keeper of the archives in the Tower, and they came across some documents from Richard's reign. And she said to the keeper, who immediately wrote it down in his notes, she said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" She was acutely aware of those precedents, and she was right to be, because in the 1640s, once resistance to Charles I was getting ahead of steam, the nobles who were standing against Charles I were desperately rifling back through the archives and repeatedly citing the deposition articles of Richard II as justification for what they were embarking on. So yes, it's a fascinating story of Richard II, the play in the 1590s, as a mirror of late Elizabethan politics, as well as what was going on. And actually, in all sorts of ways, the play compresses time, and it compresses some character. It leaves out some characters and compresses the two queens, for instance. The queen in the play is an adult rather than a little girl, for reasons that make sense in terms of the drama. But broadly speaking, the arc of the politics and the reasons that Shakespeare shows for Richard's fall are pretty much hitting the nail on the head. It's a wonderful play.
It's amazing. Well, Helen, I think I might speak for everyone when I thank you so much for giving us your time, especially in the cold evening in London. We very much look forward to your biography on Elizabeth I, and hopefully, maybe we'll get a chance to welcome you back. But really, thank you for doing this. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you over the last couple of weeks, and thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure and a privilege, and I'm very grateful to make the acquaintance of the St. George's Society in this way. And I want to thank everybody who's joined to listen. Thank you very much.
Enjoy your evening, Helen. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.